Alaska is the largest state in America and the loneliest. A place where your nearest neighbor is 6 miles away, where roads vanish under snow for days at a time, where cell service drops and darkness lasts 20 hours. People come here looking for beauty, freedom, a fresh start. What they never account for is who, or what, shares that silence with them. What watches from the tree line? What circles your house while you sleep, quietly, with your family inside? What stands outside your window, looking in? Now imagine the fear. Do you have the nerve? In Alaska, isolation isn't a horror scenario. It's just reality. Good evening, friends. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Drop it in the comments. Subscribe and help me reach 1,000 followers. Leave a like, share it with someone brave enough to watch. And whatever you do tonight, check your locks. The fear has already begun. I want to be clear about one thing before I tell you any of this. I am not the kind of person who believes in ghost stories. I am not the kind of person who scares easily. I spent 11 years as a structural engineer in Anchorage. I raised 2 daughters in a house with a broken furnace for 3 winters because we couldn't afford to fix it, and I didn't want my wife to know how bad the finances had gotten, and I once drove through a Category 1 hurricane I-95 outside of Savannah because I had a Monday morning meeting I refused to miss. I say this not to impress you but to establish context, because what happened to me on the Dalton Highway in October of 2021 has no rational explanation, and the only way I can live with that is to be completely honest about who I was before it happened and who I became after. My name is David Carver. I was 43 years old. I had a wife named Karen, daughters named Sophie and Reese, a mortgage on a house in Eagle River, and a contract job that required me to do site assessments for pipeline infrastructure at remote checkpoints along the Dalton, the 414-mile stretch of gravel and ice that connects Fairbanks to Deadhorse, running straight through the Brooks Range and into the gut of the Arctic. I had done the drive a dozen times. I knew every gas stop, every CB radio dead zone, every particular way the road narrows near Coalfoot where the shoulder disappears and there is nothing to your left but a drop and nothing to your right but darkness and spruce. I knew this road the way you know a coworker you don't entirely trust, familiar enough to be comfortable, close enough to be caught off guard. The drive up from Fairbanks had been clean. The weather reports out of the National Weather Service station were manageable, light snow, temperatures dropping to single digits overnight, nothing the truck couldn't handle. I was driving a 2019 Ford F-250 with a full tank, a secondary 5-gallon reserve in the bed, a sleeping bag rated to -30, 2 cases of water, enough protein bars to last 4 days, a first aid kit, a hand warmer supply that could heat a small apartment, and a CB radio mounted to the dash. I had done everything right. I want you to understand that. I had done every single thing right. The alternator gave out 6 miles past the Coalfoot camp at approximately 9:40 p.m. There was no dramatic warning. No grinding, no shriek of metal, no warning light theatrical enough to signal what was happening. The dashboard simply dimmed. Then the headlights began to pulse. Then the engine lost power so gradually it felt almost polite, like a body deciding on its own that tonight it would simply stop. I rolled to the side of the gravel road and sat there in the sudden and absolute silence of the Arctic night with the temperature outside reading -18 Celsius and the reality of my situation settling over me like water filling a room. I want to tell you about that silence because it is important. People who have never been in the interior of Alaska in October, well past the tree line, have no reference for the specific quality of that darkness and that quiet. It is not peaceful. It is not restorative. It is the silence of a place that has never heard a human voice and has no particular interest in starting now. I sat in the cab of my dead truck and I thought about Karen, who had asked me twice that morning if I was sure about the drive. I thought about Sophie, who was 10 and had drawn me a picture of a moose that she taped to the dashboard. It was still there, slightly curled at one corner. I thought about Reese, who at 7 still slept with a nightlight and who would be going to bed right about then, probably asking her mother where Daddy was. And I thought, for the first time in a way that felt honest rather than theoretical, whether any of this had been worth it. Whether the contract money justified the exposure. Whether there was something almost reckless, almost selfish, about choosing to work in a place where the margin between routine and catastrophe was this thin. We had talked about it before. Karen had grown up in Ohio. She understood Alaska intellectually. She had come to love Anchorage, had built a life there, had friends, a book club, a garden that struggled heroically against the short summers. But the field work frightened her. She never said so directly, because she was not a woman who led with fear. She said it sideways, in questions. Do they have cell service out there? Is there a protocol? What happens if the truck breaks down? I had answered each question with competence and calm, with data about emergency protocols and satellite communicators and the CB network, and I had believed every word I said. Sitting in the dead truck at -18 with the darkness pressing against every window like something physical, I understood that I had confused preparedness with safety. They are not the same thing. I pulled out the CB and keyed the channel. I called out my position, my situation, the truck model and color, the milepost number I had noted about a quarter mile back. I did this 5 times over 20 minutes, methodically, without panic. Protocol. Stay calm. Work the problem. On the 6th attempt, a voice came back. Copy that. I hear you. Male voice. Mid-range, no particular regional accent. Calm in a way that I initially found reassuring and later found deeply wrong, because it was not the calm of a person responding to an emergency. It was the calm of a person for whom this situation was completely unsurprising. I told him my situation again, in detail. He listened without interrupting. When I finished there was a pause, 3, maybe 4 seconds, before he spoke. I'm about 12 miles out. I can come to you. 12 miles on the Dalton in October, at night, through fresh snow, in any vehicle capable of reaching me, would take a minimum of 35 to 40 minutes. That was the math. That was the reality of the road and the conditions. I thanked him, got his CB handle. He offered one that I won't repeat here because it still makes something in me go cold, and settled into wait. I left the CB on. I ate half a protein bar. I checked the temperature gauge on the truck. The cab was still holding at around 40 degrees from residual heat, but it would begin to drop within the hour. I pulled on my extra fleece. I checked my phone out of habit. No signal, obviously, hadn't had signal since Coldfoot, and I sat there in the dark with Sophie's moose drawing and the silence and the nothing. He arrived in 22 minutes. I heard the engine first, a diesel, heavy, deliberate, and then the headlights came around the bend from the south, which was wrong. Wrong direction. If he had been 12 miles out on the Dalton, he would have come from the north. 12 miles south was back toward Coldfoot, where I had come from, where I had passed nothing and no one for the last hour of driving. I noticed this. I filed it. I told myself there were a dozen explanations, a side road I hadn't marked, a turnaround point I passed in the dark. I was cold and I was relieved, and relief as a way of arguing very persuasively against your better instincts. The truck that pulled up behind me was a late model Chevy Silverado, dark green or black, hard to tell in the dark, with a snowplow attachment on the front and no markings of any kind. No contractor logo. No government insignia. Nothing. The driver got out. He was tall, over 6 feet, in canvas work pants and a heavy flannel shirt open at the collar despite the temperature. No hat. No gloves. He walked toward my truck with his hands at his sides and his face pointed directly at my window, and I had one of those moments, you know them, I think every human being knows them, the moments where your conscious mind and your instinctive mind disagree violently about what is happening, where I wanted to open the door and I also, simultaneously, wanted to lock it and never open it again. I lowered the window 2 inches. "You the one on the radio?" he said. "Yeah. David Carver." I gave him my name immediately, out of some instinct to establish reality, to make myself concrete and documented. "I am a person with a name. Remember my name." He looked at me for a moment without expression. "You can call me whatever you want," he said. I asked his name. He repeated it exactly. "You can call me whatever you want." Not evasively. Not with any apparent humor. Just flatly, as if it were a reasonable answer to a direct question, as if names were optional and he had simply chosen not to have one. Something happened in my chest that I can only describe as a slow locking, like a deadbolt being thrown one tumbler at a time. "I've got a jump kit and a tow line," he said. He was still looking at my window. Not at the truck, not past me, not around the area. At my window. At the approximate place where my face would be behind the glass. "Pop the hood, I'll take a look." I did not pop the hood. I looked through the windshield at his truck. The passenger door was slightly ajar, which I had not noticed when he arrived. The interior dome light was off, but there was enough ambient light from his headlights to see the shape of the cab, and there was something on the passenger seat, a shape, dark and vertical, that I could not resolve into anything specific. I looked at the bed of his truck. There was equipment back there, partially covered by a tarp, what looked like a gas can, a shovel with an unusually long handle, and, coiled with a precision that struck me as immediately and inexplicably horrible, a length of polypropylene rope, bright orange, with knots tied along its length at intervals that looked uniform, measured, deliberate. I have thought about those knots every single day since that night. The way they were spaced. The care it would take to tie them that way. The patience. "I think I'm going to wait for morning," I said. My voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "I've got enough gear. I'll call out on the CB when there's more traffic." He said nothing for a moment. He was still looking at the window. Then he said, "Roads don't get more traffic in the morning. Not this time of year. I'll be okay." Another pause. Longer this time. The kind of pause that isn't empty, the kind that has something moving around inside it. "You've got a drawing on your dash," he said. "Kid, draw that?" I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. "I'm going to ask you to step back from the truck," I said. I don't know where that came from. Some part of me that had decided, without consulting the rest, that this was the moment. "I appreciate you coming out here, but I'm going to wait for morning." He looked at me for 3 more seconds. I counted, because counting was something concrete to do, and then he turned and walked back to his truck with the same unhurried, even pace he arrived with. No anger. No argument. No performance of offense. He just turned and went, and that absence of reaction was more frightening to me than any threat could have been, because it meant he had made some calculation and the calculation had simply shifted. He sat in his truck for 7 minutes. I watched the taillights. I held the CB in my lap. I did not key it. I did not want him to hear me. I watched those taillights and I breathed very slowly, and I thought about Karen and Sophie and Reese with an intensity one had never brought to anything in my professional life, a white-hot specific love that felt, in that moment, exactly like terror. Then he drove away. North. Not back south, toward wherever he'd come from. North. Deeper into the route. I stayed awake the entire night. I drank water to stay alert. I ate the rest of the protein bar. I kept the CB on and I monitored every frequency and I heard nothing, no other voice, no traffic, no response when I keyed out periodically at the lowest possible volume. The temperature in the cab dropped to about 32 degrees by 3 a.m. and I put on every layer I had and got into the sleeping bag and sat upright with my back against the driver's door and watched the road through the windshield. The darkness of an Alaskan October night has a duration that is almost geological. It does not shift or ease or give you anything to track. It simply sits on you. When the light came, around 8:15, a gray grudging seep from the eastern ridge, I got out of the truck. The cold was immediate and total, the kind that gets inside your respiratory system before you've finished your first breath. I walked around the F-250 once, then twice. The snow that had fallen overnight was undisturbed on 3 sides of the vehicle. On the driver's side, the side facing the road, the side where he had stood at my window, the snow was marked. Not by footprints from arrival or departure. Those prints were there, yes, his approach from his truck, the few feet of ground he'd stood on, his return. But around those prints, in the snow between the road and my door and extending several feet in both directions along the truck's length, there were additional impressions. Circular. Overlapping. The unmistakable pattern of someone who had walked slowly around and around and around a fixed perimeter for a long time. He had come back. On foot. After dark. After I'd locked the doors. And he had circled my truck. I counted the overlapping tracks, tried to estimate duration from the depth of layering for what must have been the better part of 2 hours. I never heard him. I never heard him at all. A fuel truck heading south came by at 9:40 and pulled me to Coldfoot. The driver, a Fairbanks man named Terry who had done this run for 15 years, listened to my account with the careful attention of someone who has heard strange things before and knows the difference between the ones that are probably nothing and the ones that are probably something. He didn't dismiss it. He didn't elaborate on it either. He just drove and listened, and when I finished he said, quietly, "There are people up here that aren't right. You did right staying in the truck." I called Karen from Coldfoot. I told her about the alternator. I did not tell her about the man. I listened to her voice and I listened to Reese in the background asking if that was Daddy, and Sophie saying something I couldn't quite hear, and I sat in the plastic chair of the Coldfoot camp office and I made myself a promise about the field contracts that I kept. 3 weeks later, I requested the CB incident logs from the stretch of Dalton around milepost 175 for the night of October 9th. There was one transmission log from my unit. No incoming transmissions were recorded from any other unit on any monitor frequency during the 6-hour window I specified. He was never on the radio. Whatever I heard that night, whatever answered me in that flat and careful voice, did not exist in any system that should have been able to pick it up. He was not logged. He was not there. And yet he stood at my window and he knew, without being able to see inside the cab, without any reasonable angle on the dashboard, that there was a child's drawing taped to my dash. I have gone back through my memory of that night so many times that it has started to feel worn in certain places, smoothed down by repetition, and there is one moment I keep returning to that I have never been able to resolve. When I told him I was going to wait for morning and asked him to step back, in that 3-second pause before he turned and left, he tilted his head very slightly to the left. A degree or two. The way someone does when they are listening to something you cannot hear. And then he turned. As if something had told him to go. As if the decision had not been his. I don't know what he was. I don't know what he wanted. I know that he had rope in the back of his truck tied with the patience of someone for whom patience is not a virtue but a method. I know that he circled my truck in the dark for 2 hours in -20-degree cold without a hat or gloves and without making a single sound I could detect through 2 layers of glass and a locked door. I know that no one recorded him on any radio frequency. I know that the direction he came from was wrong and the direction he left in was worse. I know that Sophie's drawing is still in a box in our garage in Eagle River. I took it off the dashboard the morning I got back. I couldn't explain to Karen why. I couldn't explain that every time I looked at it I saw him standing at the window in the dark, looking at approximately the place where my face was, saying you can call me whatever you want, with a quiet so complete it sounded less like a personality and more like a decision. I resigned the contract in November. We stayed in Anchorage. Karen had her life there, the girls were in school, it wasn't the right time to move, but I stopped taking field work above Fairbanks. Some of my colleagues asked why. I told them the commute had gotten old. What I did not tell them, what I have told almost no one, is that 6 months after that night my phone rang at 2:58 in the morning. Unknown number. I answered it because I was half asleep and my instincts were running point. There was silence on the line, not the silence of a bad connection, not the static silence of a dropped call. Breathing silence. Present silence. The silence of a thing that had learned to be very quiet over a very long time. It lasted 47 seconds. I counted. Then the line went dead. I have never answered an unknown number at night since. I have a CB radio in my current work truck and I have not used it once. I tell myself I don't need it on the routes I run now. I tell myself that's the reason. What I actually believe is this: there are places in Alaska where the distance between you and everything that could help you is so vast, so absolute, so indifferent, that certain kinds of people, certain kinds of things, understand that distance the way a predator understands terrain. They know that no one is coming. They know that the darkness lasts 14 hours and the cold eats engines and the radio frequencies are empty and the road goes on for 400 miles in either direction with nothing in between that has a face you could call familiar. They know that out there, in the middle of all that nothing, you have exactly one decision to make. And they will wait, very patiently, with their rope and their silence, for you to make the wrong one. I never thought a flat tire could be the thing that unmade me. I mean that literally. I have spent 11 months trying to put myself back together after what happened on that road, and I still can't sleep past 3 in the morning without waking up in a cold sweat, reaching for my phone, checking the locks. My therapist, a kind woman in Portland who charges $220 an hour and smells like chamomile, tells me I need to stop replaying it. She says the mind has a way of filling in details that weren't there, of building a monster out of something that might have been nothing. I nod when she says this. I tell her she's probably right. Then I go home and I replay every second of it, because I know what I saw, and the only thing more terrifying than the truth is the possibility that someone like her could convince me it wasn't real. It was September in Alaska. If you've never been there in September, let me paint the picture for you, because the geography matters. It's not just cold. Cold is what you feel in Chicago or Denver, something manageable, something your body knows how to negotiate with. Alaska in September is something different. It's a cold that feels intentional, like the land itself has decided it's done with you and is beginning the slow process of erasing every trace that humans were ever foolish enough to show up. The sky turns colors you don't have names for, not quite purple, not quite orange, something in between that makes you feel like you're standing at the edge of the world looking in. The trees are thick and black against it. Spruce mostly, packed so tight along the sides of the road that you can't see more than 15 feet into them, and beyond that 15 feet is just darkness that goes on for 100 miles in every direction. We were driving from Fairbanks to the entrance of Denali National Park. Me and my girlfriend, Rachel. We'd flown into Fairbanks 3 days before, rented a Honda Civic that had no business being in Alaska, little sedan, 2-wheel drive, ball-dish tires, because it was the cheapest thing on the lot and we were 29 years old and still making the kinds of financial decisions that feel smart until they don't. We had a cooler in the back seat, 2 duffel bags, a camera Rachel used for our photography work, and a Garmin GPS that kept losing signal every 40 minutes because we were, in the truest sense of the phrase, in the middle of nowhere. The road between Fairbanks and Denali is called the Parks Highway. You may have driven highways in the lower 48 and thought you understood what a highway was. You don't. Not until you've driven the parks. It's 2 lanes, perfectly straight for miles and miles, cutting through a landscape so vast and indifferent that the sky doesn't feel like sky anymore, it feels like a ceiling you can't reach. Gas stations appear every 70 or 80 miles, and between them there is nothing. No buildings. No turn-offs. No emergency call boxes. If something goes wrong between those gas stations, you are entirely on your own, and the mountains in the distance don't care, and the spruce trees don't care, and the gravel shoulder of the road certainly does not care. We'd stopped in Nenana, a small town, maybe 400 people, the kind of place where the local diner also doubles as the hardware store, to eat lunch and top off the tank. It was around 2 in the afternoon when we left. I remember looking at the time and thinking we had plenty of daylight. What I didn't account for, what you can't account for until you've experienced it, is how fast the light dies in Alaska in September. By 4 o'clock it was already turning that bruised color, the light dropping like something with weight to it, like it was falling rather than fading. We were about 80 kilometers south of Nenana. I know this because I checked the GPS obsessively, the way you do when you're in a place that makes you feel small, when I felt it. That unmistakable shudder through the steering wheel, that wobble that starts in your hands and travels up your arms and into your chest before your brain has even finished processing what it means. A blowout. Back left tire. The car lurched, I overcorrected, Rachel grabbed the dashboard with both hands, and we skidded onto the gravel shoulder and stopped. I sat there for a moment with the engine running and the hazard lights blinking and the GPS screen showing a long thin road going nowhere in both directions, and I thought, okay. This is manageable. People get flat tires. This is a normal human problem. There's a spare tire in the trunk and a jack somewhere under the floor mat, and we will fix this and we will be fine. I got out of the car. The cold hit me like a door. That's the only way I can describe it, like walking into a solid object. 41 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind coming off the mountains to the west, and the sound of absolutely nothing in every direction. No traffic. No animals. No wind in the trees because the trees were too dense to let the wind through. Just the ticking of the hazard lights and my own breathing. I opened the trunk. Found this spare, one of those pathetic little donut spares that look like a tire for a bicycle. Found the jack. Found the lug wrench. Started reading the instructions in the owner's manual because I had changed exactly 1 tire in my life, and that was in a parking lot in Eugene, Oregon, on a sunny Tuesday afternoon, with my father standing next to me talking me through every step. That's when I heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel. I turned around and he was already there. Already close. Maybe 20 feet away, walking toward me from the tree line, not from the road, from the trees, moving with a deliberateness that was completely wrong for the situation. When you find someone broken down on the side of the road and you want to help, you call out from a distance. You wave. You give them time to process your presence. This man did none of those things. He just appeared, already in motion, already aimed at me like a compass needle pointing north. He was tall. 6'2", maybe 6'3". Heavy through the shoulders and chest, the kind of build that tells you he'd worked outdoors his whole life. He was wearing a canvas work jacket, dark green, and Carhartt pants tucked into rubber boots. He had a beard that was mostly gray and eyes that were the color of old ice, not blue, exactly, but that pale, washed-out gray that blue becomes when all the warmth has been taken out of it. He wasn't wearing a hat, which struck me as wrong. It was 41 degrees and he had no hat and no gloves and he looked completely comfortable. "Looks like you got a problem," he said. His voice was calm. measured. The kind of calm that isn't relaxed but controlled, the calm of someone who has decided ahead of time what they're going to say and is executing it without variation. I've turned that sentence over in my mind 1,000 times. Looks like you got a problem. It sounds ordinary. It is ordinary. But there was something underneath it, something in the rhythm of it, that made the hair on my arms stand up before I'd even consciously registered anything was wrong. Yeah, I said. Blowout. We're okay though, we've got the spare. Those little donuts are no good, he said, nodding toward the trunk. He was still walking toward me. He hadn't slowed down. I got proper tire up at my place. 5 kilometers up that way. He gestured vaguely north, back toward the tree line, back toward wherever he had come from. Take you 20 minutes. Rachel had gotten out of the car. I could feel her standing behind me. She didn't say anything, and that was its own kind of terrifying, because Rachel talked constantly. She had narrated our entire trip from the moment we landed in Fairbanks, the architecture of the airport, the quality of the rental car agent's customer service, the specific shade of green the tundra turned when you drove through it at 70 miles an hour. She had opinions about everything and shared all of them, always, without hesitation. Her silence now landed on the back of my neck like a cold hand. We appreciate it, I said, but I think we can manage with the spare. The man nodded slowly. Too slowly. The kind of nod that isn't agreement but acknowledgement. I have heard what you said and I am filing it somewhere, and he stopped walking about 12 feet away from me. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. Just stood there. Not safe to drive on those things for long, he said. Especially not in the dark. He glanced at the sky when he said this. And he was right. The light was going fast, faster than I'd expected, the color draining out of it like water out of a tub. But the way he said it didn't feel like concern. It felt like information. Like he was telling me something about the near future that he already knew and was simply conveying. I started putting the jack under the car. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't look at him directly, so I looked at the task in front of me, and I listened. Listened to his breathing. Listened to the sound of gravel shifting as his weight moved. I was acutely, horrifyingly aware of exactly where he was in space relative to me, the way you're aware of a wasp in a room, not looking at it but tracking it with every nerve you have. Rachel came around the side of the car. I glanced up at her. Her face was doing something I had never seen it do before, not fear exactly, but a kind of hyper-focused attention, the look of someone who's processing information very quickly and not liking any of their conclusions. She crouched down next to me like she was going to help with the tire, and she said, very quietly, without moving her lips much, "He's been watching our bags." I made myself not react. Made myself keep turning the jack handle. "The whole time," she said. "Not us. The bags." Our duffel bags were visible through the rear window. Everything we brought for 3 weeks in Alaska. Clothes, gear, Rachel's camera equipment, a Nikon body worth about $4,000 and 3 lenses. The camera was in its own case, but it wasn't hidden. Anyone looking through that window could have seen it. I glanced back at the man. He was still in the same spot. Still with his hands in his pockets. His eyes weren't on the bags now, they were on me. And there was nothing in them. That's what got me. Not malice, not hunger, not the cartoonish menace you see in horror movies. Just nothing. A flat, patient nothing, like the look of someone who has done something many times and feels nothing particular about doing it again. "We're good, thanks," I said, louder than necessary, forcing brightness into my voice. The American politeness reflex, kicking in even now, even here. "Sorry to bother you, have a nice day, we're all fine here." He didn't respond. He just watched. It took me 22 minutes to change that tire. I know because I was tracking time obsessively on my watch. 22 minutes of lying on cold gravel, knuckles bleeding from where I scraped them on the wheel well, Rachel handing me tools without speaking, both of us hyper-aware of the man standing 12 feet away watching us work. He didn't offer to help. He didn't make small talk. He just stood there in the fading light with his hands in his pockets and his pale eyes and his absolute stillness, and every second of it felt like a countdown to something I couldn't name. When I finally got the spare on and the car lowered off the jack, I stood up and looked for him. He was gone. Not walking away down the road. Not heading back into the trees. Just gone. Like he'd been erased. The gravel shoulder where he'd been standing was empty, and the tree line was dark and impenetrable, and there was no sound, no movement, nothing to tell me where he'd gone or how fast or in what direction. It was as if the land had simply taken him back. Rachel and I got in the car. I locked the doors before I'd even put on my seatbelt, which is something I had never done in my life. I pulled back onto the park's highway and drove south and didn't say anything for probably 5 minutes, both of us just sitting in the sound of the engine and the hiss of the tires on asphalt and our own breathing. Then Rachel said, quietly, there was something wrong with him. I didn't answer her. Because there are no words built to describe what I'd felt standing next to that man. Not fear, not exactly. Something more specific. The feeling of being evaluated. The feeling of being sized up not as a person but as a problem, one with variables, with obstacles, with solutions that hadn't yet been determined. The feeling of being a thing in the mind of someone who was very calmly deciding what to do with you. We drove for 40 minutes on that miserable little donut spare, going no faster than 50 kilometers an hour. I was watching the road, watching the mirrors, watching the tree line on both sides, though God knows why, like I could see anything in there. The darkness between those spruce trees was absolute. Anything could have been in there. Anything could have been watching us go by from 20 feet inside that black wall of timber, and we would never have known. That's what Alaska does to you. That's the thing nobody tells you before you go. The wilderness isn't a backdrop. It's not scenery. It's a presence, active and immense, and it makes you understand, at a cellular level, what it actually means to be a soft-bodied creature in a world that was not designed for you. Every city you've ever lived in, every suburb, every lit parking lot, every apartment building with a buzzer system and a doorman is a fiction. A careful, collaborative fiction that humans have spent 10,000 years constructing to convince themselves they are safe. Drive far enough north and the fiction falls apart and you see what's underneath, and what's underneath is this: you are small and you are alone and there is nothing between you and whatever is out there except the choices you make in the next few seconds. The turnoff appeared on the right side of the road about 45 minutes after we'd left the man behind. Just a dirt road cutting into the trees, unmarked, no mailbox, no reflectors. I wouldn't have noticed it if I hadn't been watching the mirror. His truck was parked at the entrance to that dirt road. Not running. No lights. No exhaust in the cold air. Just parked there, driver's side facing the highway, positioned at an angle that pointed directly south, exactly the direction we'd been traveling. He hadn't walked back into the trees. He'd walked along the tree line, staying invisible, and gotten to his truck, and driven it here, and parked it facing the direction we were going. I went 68 kilometers on that donut spare before I found a gas station. I pulled in, topped off the tank, went inside, and stood in the light and the warmth under the fluorescent tubes and felt my hands shaking for the first time since I'd put them on the steering wheel. The guy behind the counter was young, maybe 20, wearing a Carhartt hoodie and listening to something through one earbud. He looked up at me with the mild, unhurried friendliness of someone who worked in a place where nothing ever happened, and I thought about telling him. About the man on the road. About the truck. About the way those eyes had looked at our bags. I didn't say anything. Because what would I say? A man offered to help us. He stood too close and watched us too carefully and followed us in his truck to a turnoff 45 kilometers down the road. None of that is illegal. None of that is something the police can act on. None of that even sounds like anything when you say it out loud in a gas station at night in Alaska, standing under fluorescent lights, shaking. We drove the rest of the way to Denali without stopping. We checked into the lodge at 9:30 that night. I put the chain on the door and the deadbolt and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, and Rachel came and sat next to me without saying anything, and we just stayed like that. I didn't sleep that night. Not at all. I lay in the dark and I thought about the 41 photographs Rachel had taken of the Alaskan wilderness over the first 3 days of our trip, photos she was proud of, photos she was planning to submit to a magazine. And I thought about how, in the back of our rental car, clearly visible through the window, there was a Nikon camera body and 3 lenses worth collectively more than some people's used cars. And I thought about how many times we had left the car unattended in remote locations over those 3 days. Hiking trails with empty parking lots. Unmarked pull-offs where we'd stopped to look at mountains. Gas stations where we'd both gone inside. And I thought about this. We had stopped in Nenana at 2 in the afternoon. We had parked on the main street for almost an hour while we ate lunch and walked around. Any number of people could have looked through our windows. Any number of people could have seen what was in the back seat and made a decision and driven the park's highway south and waited. He wasn't walking out of those trees. He'd been waiting. He parked somewhere we couldn't see, maybe a mile up that dirt road, maybe less, and when he heard the blowout, when he heard the car slow down and stop, he'd gotten out and walked through the trees along the road until he reached us. Patient. Unhurried. Calm. I don't know what he intended to do. I don't know what the outcome would have been if Rachel hadn't come around the side of the car. If I'd been alone. If I'd said yes to the offer of a tire at his place 5 kilometers up that road with no name on no map in a part of Alaska where no one would hear anything and nothing would be found until spring, if then. I don't know, and that's the part that my therapist can't fix, and that's the part that wakes me up at 3 in the morning. Not what happened. What didn't happen? The door I didn't walk through. The door that was open. We left Alaska 4 days early. I told people it was because of the weather. Rachel told people she hadn't gotten the shots she wanted. We have not talked about that road, that tire, that man, in 11 months. We talk around it sometimes, the way you walk around a hole in the floor. You know it's there, you know the dimensions of it, you navigate carefully, and you never look directly down. I still have the voicemail I recorded on my phone on the side of the park's highway. I don't know why I did it, some animal instinct, I think, the same one that made me memorize his face and the color of his jacket and the number of the boot tread I could see from where I was lying on the gravel. 37 seconds of wind and gravel and the sound of the jack clicking and a man's breathing, slow and even, 12 feet behind me. I've listened to it maybe 200 times. In the last 4 seconds, just before I stop the recording, you can hear something. Barely audible under the wind. The sound of footsteps on gravel, moving away. Not toward the road. Toward the trees. He was already leaving. Already done with us. Already, maybe, recalculating. Already thinking about the next car, the next flat tire, the next soft-bodied creature that would stop on that road in the dark, in the cold, in the middle of a wilderness so vast and indifferent that whatever happened there would simply disappear into it, the way everything in Alaska eventually does, swallowed by the spruce and the permafrost and the long, lightless winter, until spring, until someone remembers to look, until it is already far too late. I want to be precise about something before I tell you this, because precision is the only thing that keeps me from sounding like a man who lost his mind in the snow, which is, I understand, exactly what you might conclude anyway. I am a 41-year-old logistics coordinator from Columbus, Ohio. I have a 401k. I have an ex-wife named Patrice who still texts me on my birthday. I own a sensible used Ford F-150 and I've never missed a dentist appointment in my adult life. I am not a dramatic person. I am not someone who sees things. I am the kind of man who double-checks the weather app before deciding whether to bring an umbrella to a cookout. I want you to hold on to that portrait of me, that specific, ordinary, Midwestern version of me, as I tell you what happened in the winter of the year I decided to rent a cabin outside Talkeetna, Alaska for 3 months to figure some things out, which is what people say when their marriage dissolves and their therapist starts looking at them like a problem she doesn't have the tools to solve. The cabin was listed on a property rental site as rustic but well-equipped. The owner, a woman named Sandra who operated entirely through email and had a profile photo that looked like it was taken in the mid-90s, described it as 14 miles off the park's highway, accessible via a maintained gravel road. She sent me a PDF with instructions for the generator, the propane system, the hand pump well, and a paragraph at the bottom that said, in a font slightly smaller than the rest, cell service is limited in the area. Satellite phone is provided for emergencies. Please use responsibly. I arrived on October 3rd. The road to the cabin was not maintained. It was a dirt track with 2 grooves worn into it by previous vehicles, bordered on both sides by black spruce that pressed close enough that my side mirrors occasionally clipped branches. The drive from the park's highway took 40 minutes. I noted this without alarm. I am from Ohio. I know how to drive on bad roads. The cabin itself was fine. Better than fine, honestly. It had a wood stove that heated the main room to a genuine swelter, a full set of cast iron cookware, 3 shelves of paperback novels left by previous tenants, and a shortwave radio on a shelf above the kitchen counter that I assumed was decorative. The generator sat in a small shed attached to the eastern wall, accessible through a door that connected directly to the utility room. Sandra had said it ran on propane and that the tank beside the shed held roughly 90 days of moderate use. I checked the gauge. It read 2/3 full. The first 2 weeks were, if I'm being honest, exactly what I needed. I chopped wood in the mornings. I read 2 novels I would never have read in Columbus. I cooked elaborate breakfasts at 10 in the morning because no one was waiting for me to be anywhere. The silence was not uncomfortable, it was layered and alive in a way that city silence never is. I could hear the Susitna River moving a mile to the west. I could hear ravens calling from somewhere above the spruce line at dusk. I felt my shoulders, which had been somewhere near my ears for 2 years, begin the slow process of descending. The snow started on October 19th. Light at first, a few inches overnight, nothing alarming. I had good boots. I had 2 pairs of good boots. I had done the research. By October 23rd, I had 4 feet of snow on the ground and it was still coming down. By October 26th, the road had ceased to exist. Not was blocked, not was difficult, ceased. The 2 grooves in the dirt track had filled and leveled and the surrounding spruce had closed their branches under the weight of accumulation and there was simply no road-shaped feature in the landscape anymore. There was forest and there was snow and there was the cabin and there was me inside it, watching from the window as the geography of my exit erased itself. I was not panicked. I had supplies. Sandra's rental agreement had included a checklist that I had followed with characteristic Ohio thoroughness: 60 days of dried goods, a medical kit, a hand crank radio for weather broadcasts, 3 cases of water, 200 pounds of firewood already stacked on the covered porch. The satellite phone charged on the kitchen counter. I called Sandra. Her voicemail said she was traveling through December and to contact her emergency number, which I did. A man answered who said his name was Brett, that he was Sandra's brother, and that heavy snowfall was normal up there and that the road guys usually get out that way by mid-November. Mid-November was 3 weeks away. I said that was fine. I believed that was fine. I am, at my foundation, a person who believes things will be fine. The generator failed on the 10th night. Not dramatically, it didn't seize or blow or make any of the sounds machines are supposed to make when they catastrophically quit. It just stopped. One moment the small electric lights in the cabin ceiling were on, and then they were off, and the refrigerator's hum died, and the only light was from the wood stove's grate. I went to the utility room with a flashlight. I checked the propane line. I checked the carburetor. I checked every component in the troubleshooting section of the laminated sheet Sandra had left taped to the inside of the shed door. The generator did not respond to any of it. The propane gauge still read a third full. The machine simply declined. I'm not sure I can make you understand what the loss of the generator meant, concretely, to my day-to-day experience inside that cabin in a way that lands with the correct weight. You might think, no electricity, inconvenient, manageable. And yes, technically manageable. I had the wood stove. I had flashlights and candles. I had the battery-powered hand-crank radio. I had 12 fully charged power banks for my phone, which had no service but which I kept using as a clock, a notepad, and a voice recorder. What I didn't have, without the generator, was any manufactured light after dark. And in Talkeetna, Alaska, in late October, dark begins at 4:15 in the afternoon. I want you to do the math on that. If I woke at 7, and I did, obsessively, the way you do when you have no schedule to calibrate to, I had 9 hours of thin gray light and then 14 hours of absolute darkness, broken only by candlelight and whatever the wood stove threw against the walls. 14 hours is a very long time. 14 hours is the length of a transatlantic flight plus a connecting flight plus the drive to your hotel. 14 hours in a small wooden room in the dark with the wind pressing against the walls and the spruce trees cracking under ice loads in the forest outside is its own kind of psychological architecture. It builds something inside you. Something structural. I began sleeping during the day and lying awake at night. I don't know when this flipped, it happened gradually, the way water finds its level. By the second week without the generator I was sleeping from roughly noon to 5, waking in the dark, eating by candlelight, and sitting in the wood stove's warmth through the long corridor of night. The hand-crank radio pulled on a weather station out of Wasilla and, on clear nights, an AM station out of Anchorage that played country music from the 70s and 80s. I found this genuinely comforting for about a week. Then the weather station started running its emergency tone broadcasts, the two-tone pulse that precedes storm warnings, so frequently that I began to dread the radio's own sound. I turned it on less and less. The silence that replaced it was not the alive, layered silence of the first 2 weeks. It had become something else. Something I didn't have a word for. The voices on the shortwave radio started on the 15th night. I say voices, but I should be more precise. I had turned on the shortwave radio, the decorative one above the kitchen counter, on a whim, expecting nothing, maybe static, maybe some distant AM bleed-through. What I found, on a frequency I didn't write down but which I would spend a long time trying to reconstruct later, were two voices speaking in what I believe was Russian. They spoke in long, unhurried sentences with pauses between them, like people who had all the time in the world, or like people who were reading. The signal was clear, hauntingly, startlingly clear, the way shortwave signals from thousands of miles away sometimes inexplicably are in certain atmospheric conditions in the far north. I do not speak Russian. I cannot tell you what they said. But I want to be precise about the effect of it, lying in my sleeping bag with candles guttering on the table and 14 feet of snow outside and the temperature showing -22 on the outdoor thermometer I'd hung by the window, listening to two disembodied voices in a language I did not understand speak with complete calm from somewhere I could not locate. It was one of the most frightening experiences of my life, and I am still not entirely sure why. It shouldn't have been frightening. It was just two people talking, probably somewhere in Siberia, probably about something entirely mundane. But at 2 in the morning on the 15th night of isolation, in a place that was as geographically remote from my ordinary life as I had ever been, those voices felt like something else. They felt like evidence that the world I knew did not extend to where I was, that I had moved outside the boundary of it. I turned the radio off. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. The knocking started on the 19th night. I have thought about this so many times since, have lain awake in my apartment in Columbus reconstructing the sequence of events and the acoustics of that cabin and every rational explanation I can generate, and I keep arriving at the same place. I cannot explain the knocking. It came from the north wall. Not the door, the north wall, which faced the forest and which had a window I had covered with a wool blanket for insulation. One knock, and then silence, and then another knock, and then silence. Spaced approximately 2 minutes apart. I timed it on my phone. 2 minutes, sometimes a few seconds over, never under. For 3 hours I sat in my sleeping bag in the main room and listened to it and did not move, and I want to be specific about this for you. The temperature outside was minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Nothing lives comfortably at minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit. A bear in hibernation would not stir. A moose would be standing in a spruce thicket with its back to the wind, burning calories just to stay alive. Whatever was knocking on my north wall at 2-minute intervals at minus 28 degrees was either a mechanical process I couldn't identify, ice-load stress on the logs, some thermal expansion phenomenon, or it was a person. And if it was a person, I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know if that was better or worse than no explanation at all. I went to the window on the 4th night of knocking and pulled the wool blanket back an inch. The beam of my headlamp hit the snowfield between the cabin and the tree line, and I stood there for a long time looking at nothing. Just white. Just snow. Just the black vertical lines of the spruce trunks at the edge of the light. I put the blanket back and the knocking resumed 20 minutes later. On the 21st night I got the voice recorder on my phone running before it started. I put the phone on the kitchen table and sat in the armchair with the .30-06 I brought for bear encounters, and I waited. The knocking started at 12:40. I let it run. 3 hours of recording. When it stopped, I sat until dawn began to gray the window seams, and then I put on every layer I owned and went outside. The north wall of the cabin was clear. No branch contact, the nearest tree was 15 yards out. The logs were undamaged. No animal tracks. No disturbance in the snow. I walked the perimeter of the cabin in the gray dawn light, crunching through the crust, and there was nothing. Just my own tracks coming around from the front door. I came back inside and picked up the phone and played the recording. I don't know how to write this part without sounding like a man who lost his mind in the snow. The recording had picked up sounds. It had picked up the fire crackling. It had picked up the wind working at the window frames. It had picked up something that might have been my breathing, slow and controlled in the armchair. What it had not picked up was any knocking. 3 hours of knocking that I had heard clearly, that I had timed and counted and sat with, and the phone's microphone, 2 feet from the north wall, had captured nothing. I replayed it 4 times. I put in my earbuds and turned the volume to maximum. The silence in the recording where the knocking should have been was a specific, material thing. I could feel it. And then, at the very end of the recording, in the few minutes before I had stopped it, I heard something else. Something the microphone had picked up that had not been audible to me in the room at the time. A sound that I am going to describe as accurately as I can. It was the sound of someone crying. Not loudly. Quietly. The way you cry when you're trying not to be heard. Intermittent, restrained, entirely human. Somewhere very close to the microphone. The sound of someone crying was my voice. I did not remember crying. I have no memory of it. I was sitting in that chair with a rifle across my knees, completely awake, and at some point in those 3 hours I was crying quietly in a way I cannot account for. My own distress had become inaudible to me. My mind had, apparently, found some partition between what I was experiencing and what I was permitted to consciously register, and it had routed the overflow somewhere I couldn't access. That frightened me more than any knocking. More than the Russian voices. More than the erased road and the dead generator and the expanse of dark that pressed against the cabin for 14 hours out of every 24. The realization that my own mind had been doing things without my participation, processing something in the dark while I sat there thinking I was simply waiting. The road crew reached me on November 14th. 2 men in a state DOT truck who came through with a plow and were, I think, genuinely startled to find a vehicle parked in the snowfield beside the cabin and a man standing on the porch watching them come up the cleared road like he was watching a rescue team land. One of them, a big man named Leo with a mustache and a canvas jacket, asked if I was all right. I said yes. He looked at me for a moment and then at the cabin and then back at me and said, "How long you been in there?" 23 days, I said. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're deciding whether to say the next thing or not. He said, "You want to drive out with us?" I said I had a few more weeks on the rental. He handed me a card with the DOT dispatch number on it. "Road gets bad again," he said. "You call that number and they'll send someone." He paused. "Or you can just go." I did not go that day. I stayed another 2 weeks, which I am not able to explain in any satisfying way. Partly stubbornness. Partly the strange attachment you develop to a place that has put you through something, the way a difficult relationship leaves a residue of intimacy even after it's become harmful. Partly because leaving felt like admitting the thing I was most afraid to admit, that I had not been all right. That something in those 3 weeks had reached through the dark and the cold and the silence and found the parts of me that were already damaged before I arrived, and had worked on them. I sent the recording to an audio technician in Anchorage, found her through a university contact, who confirmed there was no knocking captured on the file. She also confirmed that the crying was real, was human, and was, based on the acoustic signature, coming from approximately the same location as the microphone. She offered no interpretation. She didn't seem to think one was needed. I still have the recording on my phone. I have listened to it twice since leaving Alaska. I do not plan to listen to it again, but I haven't deleted it either, and I think that tells you something about what those 3 weeks built inside me. Something I can't bring myself to either confront or release. The last thing I will tell you is this: I looked up the rental history of that cabin before I wrote this. It took some doing. Property records in the Matanuska-Susitna borough are not the most navigable system, but I found it eventually. The cabin had been registered to 4 different owners between 1991 and the present. 3 of them sold within 2 years of purchasing it. The 4th, the owner before Sandra, held it for 11 years and then transferred ownership through an estate proceeding. His name was Raymond Follett. He died in the cabin in November 2009. The cause of death listed in the probate record was cardiac arrest, which is a thing that happens to people. He was 63 years old. He had no next of kin listed. The probate record included an inventory of the personal property left in the cabin, which I assume Sandra or her predecessor had simply left in place because it was easier than removing it. The list is long and mostly unremarkable: furniture, kitchenware, tools, clothing. Halfway down the inventory list, itemized between 1 portable television, non-functional, and 3 boxes miscellaneous books, paperback. 1 shortwave radio, operational. Located on shelf above kitchen counter. I closed the browser. I sat in my apartment in Columbus for a while. Outside my window, a city of 900,000 people moved through its ordinary rhythms. My phone sat on the desk beside my laptop, and on it was a recording of my own crying that I do not remember making, taken on the 21st night, in a cabin where a man named Raymond Follett spent 11 winters alone before dying in November with no one to find him until spring. I looked out the window at Columbus, at the traffic, at the lit windows of the building across the street, at all of it, the whole comprehensible grid of a life lived inside the boundary of the world I recognize. And I thought, the radio was already there when I arrived. Someone had to turn it on. I need to tell you something about the kind of person I was before Dale, because it matters. It matters in the way that context always matters when you're trying to understand how a careful, reasonable human being ends up standing in a stranger's house looking at photographs of themselves through their own kitchen window. I was a 38-year-old high school history teacher from Bend, Oregon. 11 years in the same classroom. The same drive down Century Drive every morning, the same coffee from the same Dutch brothers, the same parking spot. My name is Michael Garrett, and I was the kind of man who remembered students' birthdays and graded papers on Sunday afternoons and had, for 2 consecutive years, been voted most likely to still be teaching here in 20 years by the senior class yearbook committee, which they meant as a compliment and which I accepted as one. Then my brother Kevin died of a fentanyl overdose in his apartment in Phoenix. He was 34. He had been clean for 16 months. The relapse lasted 4 days and killed him on the 5th. I don't tell you this for sympathy. I tell you because it is the precise, mechanical reason I ended up in Alaska, because grief, real grief, the kind that reorganizes the interior architecture of who you are, requires space. I needed to be somewhere that had no Kevin-shaped negative space. No places where I almost called him. No highway exits where we pulled off to argue and then laugh about it. I needed geography that was entirely new, entirely untouched by the specific texture of my life, and I needed a lot of it. A lot of empty. The cabin outside Talkeetna was listed for $350 a month. I signed a 4-month lease beginning September 1st. I packed my truck with enough to survive and I drove north from Bend through British Columbia and into the Yukon and across the border at Beaver Creek and down the Alaska Highway to Anchorage and north up the Parks Highway to the dirt road that terminated at a 2-room log cabin on 12 acres of spruce and river birch with a clear view of the Alaska Range on days when the clouds lifted. The isolation was not incidental. It was the whole point. The nearest town with a gas station and a post office was Talkeetna, 40 minutes south on the Parks Highway. The nearest city was Wasilla, 90 minutes. The nearest neighbor, according to the woman who managed the property, a practical, no-nonsense Alaskan named Carol who smelled like wood smoke and handed me a set of keys with the same energy as a person concluding a meeting, was 6 miles east down a logging road that hadn't been actively logged in 20 years. Family named Haskell used to be out that way, she said, already turning toward her truck. Sold off 2 years back. Young fella bought it. Keeps to himself. She paused with her hand on the door handle, and I thought she was going to say something else about him, something specific, but instead she said, cell service is spotty. Landline in the kitchen works when the weather's decent. That was the entirety of my orientation. I want to be exact about the timeline, because it matters to understanding how I didn't see it. In early September, I was present in the way only the recently grieving can be, hyper-alert to sensory detail, oddly grateful for physical discomfort, genuinely moved by the quality of morning light through spruce trees. I split firewood for 2 hours every morning and it felt like something close to meditation. I cooked simple food slowly. I read Kevin's copy of Lonesome Dove, which I'd borrowed from his shelf 6 months before he died and never returned, and I cried at appropriate moments and let the crying finish and felt, incrementally, like a person who might eventually be okay. I did not think about my neighbor to the east. I barely thought about other people at all. He knocked on my door at 2 in the morning on September 27th. I know the exact date because I had been keeping a journal, something my therapist had suggested, a practice I'd never managed to sustain in bed but which came easily in the cabin, where there was nothing to fill the evenings except reading and writing and the shortwave radio and the sounds the forest made. I had written the date at the top of the page 20 minutes before the knock. The knock itself was, and I've turned this detail over many times since, too deliberate to be urgent. It wasn't the frantic pounding of someone in trouble. It was 3 knocks, evenly spaced, the way you knock on an office door. Measured. Patient. Like someone who had rehearsed it. I turned on the porch light and opened the door with the security chain latched, and there he was. Dale was tall, 6'2", maybe more, with a wide, flat face that had been weathered by outdoor work into something that photographed older than it was. He was wearing a headlamp and a canvas Carhartt jacket, and the headlamp was on, aimed at his own chin the way people hold a flashlight when they want you to be able to see their face. It occurred to me later that this was a specific, calculated gesture. He had thought about what would make him appear safe. He said his name was Dale. He said he lived 6 miles east. He said his generator had died that afternoon and his daughter had developed a fever and he was out of the antibiotics she'd been prescribed, and he didn't want to drive into Talkeetna at this hour on a road he didn't trust in the dark. He said his daughter's name was Lily. He said she was 7. He said he'd seen my lights from the logging road and figured it was worth asking. I want to be precise about the sequence of my thoughts, because in retrospect this is where I should have seen it. My first thought was, generators failing in September, that's bad timing. My second thought was, a 7-year-old with a fever, that's serious. My third thought, which arrived quickly enough that it crowded out any lingering skepticism, I am a person who helps. I am a person who was raised by parents who would have done the same thing without a second's hesitation, and my brother is dead and I cannot give him anything anymore, but I can give something to this man at my door at 2 in the morning. I unlatched the chain. I had a travel medical kit in my pack. Carol had specifically recommended one, and I'd ordered a comprehensive one from Amazon before leaving Bend. It included a 5-day course of amoxicillin, which I handed to Dale along with a bottle of children's ibuprofen I hadn't used. He held them in both hands and looked at them and then looked at me with an expression of relief so complete and so specific that I felt an actual warmth in my chest at producing it. He said thank you with the sincerity of a man who meant it the way people rarely mean small phrases like that. He was at my door for 11 minutes. He left. I went back to bed and felt, genuinely, like a good person, which was not a feeling I had managed with any regularity since Kevin. I did not see him again for 3 weeks. In that time, autumn settled fully over the Susitna Valley. The birch trees went gold and then bare. The first real cold came down from the range, and I woke one morning to find the world outside the window had simplified itself overnight into gray sky and white ground and black trees, and it was one of the most terrifying and beautiful things I had ever seen. Terrifying because it made the distance to anything feel genuinely abstract. Beautiful for the same reason. I thought about Dale occasionally. I thought I should go introduce myself properly. I thought 6 miles is far on a logging road in October. I thought he'll come by again sometime. He came by on October 20th. This time in daylight, mid-afternoon, his truck parking at the edge of my driveway while I was splitting wood on the porch. He walked up in the same Carhartt jacket, same measured pace, and I noticed this time that he had the kind of stillness in his body that some very large men have, the kind that isn't relaxed exactly but is practiced. The difference between a man who is calm and a man who has learned to appear calm. He said the antibiotics had worked. Said Lily was fine. He brought me a jar of something he put up himself, lingonberry jam, a dark red color in a mason jar with a piece of cloth tied over the lid. He handed it to me and said it was the least he could do. I said it wasn't necessary. He said he thought it was. We talked for 20 minutes on my porch. He said he'd come from Montana, which I registered but didn't examine. He said he was doing some private contracting work, something he described vaguely as surveying and assessment, which in Alaska is a phrase that covers a wide enough range of activities that I didn't push it. He asked what I did. I said I was on a leave of absence from teaching. He nodded as if this were a completely normal thing, which it is, which many people do, which is part of how it worked. He asked, at some point in those 20 minutes, whether I had a landline or whether I relied on the satellite phone for emergency contact. I told him the landline in the kitchen worked most of the time. I told him the satellite phone was backup. I remember noting to myself as I said it that this was probably useful local information for a neighbor to have. He left. I opened the jar of jam that evening and spread some on crackers, and it was extraordinary, rich and slightly tart, clearly homemade by someone who knew what they were doing. I put it in the refrigerator and felt the specific, modest warmth of a neighborly exchange conducted properly. I thought, this is what rural Alaska is supposed to be like. People who help each other. People who show up. I think about that a lot now. That warmth I felt. That specific, completely manufactured warmth. The third visit was November 3rd. He came at dusk, which I should have noted as strange. You don't drive 6 miles on a logging road at dusk in November without a reason that's more than social. He said he was passing through on his way back from a job site. He stood on my porch and we talked for 10 minutes. He asked if I'd gotten out to Talkeetna recently. I said not in a couple of weeks. He nodded. He said the park's highway had been icy but passable. He asked if I was set for winter. He left before dark. I found the photographs on November 18th. I want to be careful and precise about how I found them, because the sequence matters. I had been thinking about Dale for a week before I went to his property, not out of suspicion but out of a vague, unarticulated social conscience, the kind that tells you a friendship has been asymmetrical and you should equalize it. He had come to me 3 times. I had never gone to him. I had his general direction but not a specific address. So I drove the logging road with the approximate mileage Carol had given me and found his property marked by a rusted mailbox at the junction of a 2-track driveway. The cabin was larger than mine. Newer looking, with a metal roof and a covered porch and a generator shed that showed no signs of recent failure. I parked and called out. No answer. The truck was gone. I walked toward the porch to leave a note. I had a notepad in my jacket pocket, and the door to the cabin was not closed all the way. Not open, but not latched. The wind had pushed it a few inches inward. I knocked on the open door and called out again. The sound went into an interior that felt empty in the specific way that a place without people in it feels empty. I pushed the door open farther. I want to be honest about this decision. I pushed it open because the generator that had supposedly failed on September 27th looked perfectly functional from where I was standing, and something about that small, specific discrepancy had finally surfaced in me as a question. I stepped into the cabin. The main room was clean and sparsely furnished. A table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, a set of shelves. The shelves held tools, a radio, some paperback books. A kitchen along one wall. Nothing alarming. Nothing that made me feel anything specific. I almost left. I was 3 steps from the door when I saw the corkboard. It was on the wall beside the hallway to the back room, partially obscured by the open door when you entered. A standard corkboard, the kind you buy at an office supply store, 4 feet by 3 feet, mounted with 4 screws. And pinned to it, in overlapping rows like a collage, were photographs. Of my cabin. Of my truck. Of me. I stood there for a long time. My mind did something that I have since come to understand is a documented response to this specific category of shock. It refused the information. It presented me with alternative interpretations, a previous tenant, a coincidence of similar-looking cabins, a different man entirely. It took me perhaps 90 seconds of standing in front of that corkboard before the refusals ran out and the truth settled into my chest like cold water. The photographs were taken with a telephoto lens. I could tell by the compression of the background, a technical thing I knew from a photography elective I'd taken in college and never used. The camera had been positioned at distance, at least 40 or 50 yards, and the lens had closed the gap. There were photographs of my porch in early morning light, my kitchen window with the overhead light on after dark, my truck's license plate from 3 different angles, my face in profile through the window, reading. There was one photograph of me at the kitchen table writing in my journal, taken at an angle that meant the camera had been positioned northeast of the cabin, near the tree line. There were 41 photographs. I counted them twice. In the corner of the corkboard, pinned with a single tack, was a piece of notebook paper with a list of handwritten items. It was not a list I could fully parse, abbreviations, dates, notations in a handwriting that was small and controlled and precise. But I could read the dates. The first date on the list was August 29th. I had arrived September 1st. He had been watching the cabin for 3 days before I got there. I took photos of the corkboard with my phone. I photographed the list. My hands were shaking in a way that felt distant, like watching someone else's hands shake, which I understand now is what your body does when the adrenaline is real but the mind hasn't fully connected it to a coherent threat. I left the cabin and got in my truck and drove back to my cabin and sat in the driveway for 10 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I called the Alaska State Troopers from the landline. The dispatcher was patient and professional. She said she would send someone and asked me to stay at my location. The trooper, a young woman named Sergeant Haynes who drove up from Wasilla and arrived 2 hours later, walked through my account without interrupting, made notes, and then asked me the question I had not yet thought to ask myself: do you know if he has a record? I did not know. She ran his name while I made coffee. She came back from her vehicle with a look I have since categorized as trying to deliver information without amplifying panic. Dale Pruitt, which was the name on the property lease she'd found in 15 minutes of database work, had an active warrant out of Ravalli County, Montana. Felony stalking. Aggravated criminal trespass. The warrant had been issued 14 months earlier. He had been in Alaska for 6 months. I had been his neighbor for 11 weeks. Sergeant Haynes had a second trooper respond and they went to Dale's property. His truck was gone. His cabin, when they entered with a warrant, contained the corkboard, which now had 41 photographs plus the additional ones I had taken of it on my phone. There was something nauseating about that, about how my documentation of his surveillance had become part of it. They found a second binder in the back room with printed records, my full name, my brother's name, his obituary, my school district employment record, my bend address, and a printout of the rental agreement for the cabin that could only have been obtained from the property management company's server or from the manager herself. He had known I was coming before I arrived. He had selected the location, prepared the groundwork, manufactured the encounter at my door with the sick daughter who, the troopers confirmed, did not exist. He had been inside my boundary, psychologically and physically, for longer than I had been inside Alaska. They did not find Dale Pruitt that night. They issued a BOLO. He was picked up 6 days later at the ferry terminal in Juneau, waiting for a boat to Bellingham, Washington. He told the arresting trooper that he was just a man trying to get somewhere. At his arraignment, his public defender argued that he had not physically harmed anyone. This is technically true. Dale Pruitt had not laid a hand on me. He had simply been present, systematically and deliberately, in the peripheral space of my existence, close enough to observe, far enough to deny, for long enough to constitute something I do not have a clean word for. Not assault. Not quite. Something that lives in the gap between what the law can precisely name and what it actually does to a person. I left the cabin on November 21st. I drove south on the park's highway through the Matanuska Valley, through Wasilla, through Palmer, past the inlet and the mountains, and I got on the Sterling Highway and then the Seward Highway, and I drove until I reached Seward, where I checked into a motel and slept for 14 hours. When I woke up, I went to the window and looked at the harbor. Container ships, fishing boats, ordinary human activity in ordinary daylight. I stood there for a long time. I keep coming back to the thing he knew that I didn't know he knew, that I was coming to that cabin to be invisible. To step outside the shape of my life and exist for a while in a place that had no record of me. He understood that impulse. He had found me inside it, and known it would bring me there, had set the conditions of his own invisibility around the perimeter of mine. Grief, I had thought, required emptiness. Required distance from everything that could identify and locate you. I had gone to the middle of nowhere to disappear. And somewhere in the architecture of that plan, in the very logic of it, I had made myself findable to exactly the kind of person who looks for people who are trying to not be found. Dale Pruitt pled guilty to 1 count of stalking in the 2nd degree in January and received 18 months. He will be eligible for release in 8 months from the date I am writing this. He knows where I used to live in Bend. He has my full name. He has my brother's obituary, which lists surviving family members with the civic thoroughness that obituaries always do. I moved to a different city. I did not tell my school district where. I changed my phone number. I lock every door with an awareness that I carry now like a second skeleton, present always, visible only to me. I still have the jar of Lincolnberry jam. I haven't thrown it away. I couldn't tell you why. There is something about the fact that it was real, the jam, the quality of it, the cloth tied over the lid, that I need to keep being true. That somewhere in the machinery of what he did there was something genuinely made by hand, something that required patience and skill and the specific care of someone who wanted to give you something good. I don't know what that means about him. I don't know what it means about me that I find it necessary to hold on to. The jar sits on my kitchen counter in a city I won't name. Every morning I walk past it on my way to make coffee. Every morning it is exactly where I left it, in a home where every curtain is closed and every window lock is turned and every room is illuminated, completely, before I enter it. I know he made it himself. I know it was extraordinary. I have never opened it again.